Hello everyone, how are you doing? My name's Pokemac and I'm doing pretty good myself. Welcome to Generation 3 of Pokemon. I decided that Pokemon Ruby was going to be a Nuzlocke when I started the channel because the original comic that inspired the Nuzlocke challenge took place in Pokemon Ruby. Since I already don't overlevel my Pokemon for gym leaders or use items in battle, I'm going to call this a hardcore Nuzlocke, and I have one extra clause on top of that. Since Ruby is my first playthrough of the new generation, I can only use Hoenn Pokemon in this run. And I also decided to challenge each gym leader with the same number of Pokemon that they used. While in the past I've cheated in things like evolution stones or money for vitamins or TMs from the game corner, in this run the only cheat code I used was for rare candies so that I could level up my team without having to grind. This was a double-edged sword because it meant I went up against the Elite Four with little to no EV investments. But it also made this Nuzlocke a little bit harder. And as always, I named all of my Pokemon after the same nickname theme. But to spice it up a bit, I also decided that instead of naming my player character Pokemac, TPM, or Tri, I named them after the same theme as well. So if you think you can guess my nickname theme, or have an idea for a future theme name for my Pokemon, my player character, or my rivals, leave it down below, as well as any future challenge ideas. If I use your idea, I'll credit you in the video. We've been in the intro long enough, so why don't we just move on and see how my Nuzlocke went. Starting the game out, I went to save Professor Birch, and on the way chose Monster Blood the Mudkip for what I hope is a pretty obvious reason. We made a good team and took down our first opponent fairly easily, then battled May and defeated her Trico fairly easily. Then the Nuzlocke finally started when May gave us an oddly singular Pokeball, which I put to good use by catching my first team member, Go Eat Worms, the Wurmple. I have a lot of really long nicknames in this game, so I'm just going to shorten them most of the time, so from here on, Go Eat Worms is just Worms. Then I caught who would go on to be one of my favorite team members this entire run, Fever Swamp the Poochyena. And then the slightly less exciting Ghost Beach the Wingull. In preparation for the Magma battle inside of Petalburg Woods, I got my entire team up to level 8, which evolved Worms into Cascoon. Nothing happened in the battle, so let's just go straight to the catch I had after, which was Jelly Jam the Zigzagoon, who did have pickup, which was nice, but I'd rather have had Slackoth or, Shroomish. Then, finally, before Roxanne, I caught my on-again, off-again team member, Little Shop of Hamsters, the Whismer. Then I got my entire team up to level 15 to match Roxanne's Nosepass, and chose to battle her with Monster Blood and Ghost Beach, although the battle basically was just Monster Blood. When it comes to Roxanne, 90% of the fight is against her Nosepass, because her Geodude couldn't survive a single turn against Monster Blood's Water Gun. And while most of the time I remember having trouble against Nosepass, I think it's mostly because it's bulky, so if you use something like Combuskin that can only attack physically, you're not going to get very far since it can set up Harden. It's probably similar with Trico and Grovyle since Absorb has such low base power. Unfortunately for Roxanne, I chose Mudkip, who has the highest base stat total of all starters, and Water Gun's easily able to eat half of her Nosepass's health every attack, so even though she can heal twice, it was really a matter of time before her Nosepass went down. I do feel a little bad for not using Ghost Beach, especially because from here on out, I think I use it maybe once in a gym battle where I actually had it on the team. Monster Blood hit level 16 during the battle, so afterward he evolved. After a minor side quest, I moved on to Granite Cave, where, so long as I stayed on the first floor, I was guaranteed to catch Makuhita, and I did, naming them Attack of the Mutant. With nowhere else to go before the next gym battle, I got my entire team up to level 18 to match Brawly, evolving Fever Swamp in the process. And for the battle, I only took Ghost Beach and Worms. I skip Brawly under normal circumstances basically every time I play through a Generation 3 game, and I remember having a lot of trouble against him when I was younger, but now whenever I face him at the right time, he seems to be a bit of a pushover. I mean, this is his Ruby Sapphire team and not his Emerald team, but still. Worms absolutely ate through his entire team, and even had him deal the final damage to his Machop after forcing him to heal it twice. Although I think what I did to Makuhita was even more disrespectful, since I did poison it the first turn it was on the field, and its knockoff attack did like 2 damage. I mean, the most damage it did with knockoff was remove my Oran Berry, which I was never going to need in the first place. I think the most disrespectful thing I did was still having Ghost Beach on the team, even though he again never came out. But also, there's a reason that some people use Dustox all the way until they battle the champion in these games. I'm not one of them in these games, but just wait till Platinum. With Brawly in the rear view, I moved on to the mainland of Hoenn once again, and on Route 110, caught Shock Street the Minun. They also would end up being one of my favorite team members through this entire run, and I don't even like Minun that much. Sadly, here we would also say goodbye to Worms. Not because she was dead or anything, I just didn't want her to get hurt because at this point, she was dead weight. Then I got my active team up to level 20 to face May. Any battle with May is really stressful for me, but considering I chose Mudkip and choose Mudkip most of the time, I can say that even though it's a mid-stage starter, Grovyle is terrifying. Wailmer and Numel not so much. Shock Street was able to easily knock out Wailmer in 2 hits, although it did leave him with a sliver of health, so it almost could have been a one-shot. And the only thing Numel was able to do was Growl, which let Grovyle stay on the field longer. Even with the Oran Berry I put on Ghost Beach, I think that it was entirely possible I could have had my first death here because of how strong Grovyle was. Oran Berry combined with a low roll pursuit, saving him 3 health exactly, and then that's what he lived on. Unfortunately though, every May battle from here on was just as stressful because she could do such dangerous amounts of damage. And of course her Grovyle had pursuit, so switching out isn't exactly an option. At least there's only 2 left. Then I took on Wally and felt really bad because, you know, I was easily able to crush him and his Ralts since I have a Dark type. Once I matched Watson's level, I took him on with Monster Blood, Mutant, and Hamster. The Watson battle was decided the second I chose Mudkip, and that result was made concrete the second that May's Grovyle went down without killing Monster Blood. The only way that he would even stand a chance is if he was the champion and I had to use every living team member against him. And that would really just drag out the battle because I'm pretty sure I'd still win. Honestly, this battle's hard for me to really disparage because electric types are probably my favorite, but still. Watson should have been a double battle gym leader with Plusle and Minun. It wouldn't have made him harder, but still. At least he would use a Hoenn Pokemon. Before I summited Mount Chimney to battle Team Magma, I caught Horrorland the Torkoal and Egg Monster the Swablu. Before we battle, Maxi, were you planning to, get to minimum safe distance when you activate the machine, or would it be instant, just... You know what? I don't even need to ask this question. I'm gonna beat you just to prevent whatever you were planning. Maxi here started the trend of the battles getting more intense and lasting longer, although not because he was particularly challenging, but because I decided to face Mightyena versus Fever Swamp. I did open with Mutant so that it could absorb the Intimidate that Mightyena threw out, flinch it, and then swap out, and then swapped into Fever Swamp so that she could get off Intimidate without taking it herself. But since both of them had Sand Attack, it meant that a lot of this fight was gonna come down to accuracy shenanigans. And I'll say that Fever Swamp definitely won the encounter, not because she knocked out the opponent's Mightyena, but because even with lowered accuracy, she was able to force it to heal. I did end up swapping Fever Swamp out before she finished her opponent because Bite got a critical hit, and I was worried about accuracy. However, if I think Maxi didn't interfere with the Super Potion, she would have won the day. And Mutant came in and was easily able to defeat Mightyena, who alone was responsible for about 3/4 of this battle, because at 2 times speed, it's a little under 2 minutes, and a minute 12 of that was just Mightyena. Unfortunately for Maxi, following his Mightyena was Golbat, and it didn't really do anything. Even with the free turn it got from Switch In, it wasn't able to land Supersonic on Jelly Jam, so after 3 headbutts, it was put down. Luckily though, his Ace Camerupt actually did something. It got off Ember against Monster Blood. And then he decided that maybe he should go for critical hits, so he used Focus Energy when he should have used, I don't know, Magnitude, and hoped for a high hit. I'm not gonna throw in my 2 cents about which evil team in this game is better, but I don't think that Sharpedo would have gone down as easily. Having prevented Maxi from potentially making Team Magma the next Heaven's Gate, I moved on to battle Flannery. For her, I chose the team of Monster Blood, Ghost Beach, and Fever Swamp. While the first two are pretty obvious since they're water types, I chose Fever Swamp because she was female and Flannery likes to use Attract just like Whitney. Unfortunately though, Flannery's Torkoal had White Smoke, so Intimidate would only work on her 2 Slugma. Flannery is probably my least favorite gym leader in Hoenn because she likes to use Body Slam and Attract. Add to that her Slugmas can both set up Sun and at least one of them can set up screens, it makes it a very tedious fight. And against Fever Swamp, the first Slugma set up Sun, so the rest of its time on the field I was trying to wait out Sun. And I even baited Flannery into using her Hyper Potion on the first Slugma so that she couldn't use it on Torkoal. Unfortunately though, the last thing Flannery's first Slugma did was poison Fever Swamp. But I was still able to knock it out, and when the second came in, I assumed it was going to try to set up Sun again since it had faded the turn before. So I swapped over to Monster Blood on what I assumed was a free turn. I was right that it would be a free switch, but was incorrect in assuming it was Sun. Instead, the second Slugma set up Light Screen, which was another thing I would have to wait out, but luckily I already had Monster Blood on the field and he could do stab super effective physical damage. You know, if he landed Mudshot, because for some reason, he missed Mudshot completely unprompted and then took a critical hit Flamethrower, knocking his health incredibly low. Since he was so low, once he was attracted, even though he did a lot of damage, I decided to swap him over to Ghost Beach. And his damage from Water Gun was comparable to Mudshot. Until he was paralyzed and attracted, and I was left with wagering my starter's life, or wagering his and Fever Swamp's. And I chose my starter. So, with Ghost Beach almost in the red, I swapped over to Monster Blood and took an overheat from Torkoal, almost knocking him out. And I guess that Flannery's Torkoal only has a white herb in Emerald in the remakes because its stats decreased but didn't go back up again. Not that it mattered, because even in red health, without a stat drop or a status condition, one last Mudshot was all it took for Monster Blood to knock out Flannery's Torkoal. 4 batches down, I moved on to the Route 111 Desert and caught Midnight the Cacnea, and then grabbed the Claw Fossil, who I would later revive into Can't Scare Me the Anorith. Against Norman and his 2 Slackings, I took the team of Mutant, Hamsters, and Fever Swamp. I know I'm not really good at ranking difficulty in Pokemon games because of how varied each party can be, but Norman has to be up there. And knowing how notoriously difficult Norman is, and from all of my experience with him, I chose to give Mutant the bulk up TM before battling. However, even with the defense boosts, I made a huge mistake by going for bulk up a second time while the first Slacking was slacking off. Because when he was able to move again, he chose to go for Yawn and not Facade, which put Mutant on a timer. So even though that turn he was able to one-shot the Slacking, and then the Vigoroth that came out next, he fell asleep against the third Slacking. Before going into the battle, I didn't think to add a Chesto Berry to Mutant since Oran Berries had been so important in battles prior. And not wanting to risk switching into a sleeping Pokemon later in case the worst happened, I left him in hoping he would wake up, and unfortunately he didn't on turn 3, so Slacking killed him. I was still in the battle though, so I didn't waste time and swapped over to Hamster. I did this for 2 reasons. Firstly, Norman hadn't healed yet, so if Hamsters was able to do enough damage to force Norman to heal, and then I swapped into Fever Swamp, she had a higher chance of surviving. More importantly, Slacking still had PP on a fighting type move that would more than likely one-shot her. So with Hamsters on the field, I started a pattern where, on the Slacking turns, I would howl, and then whenever he was tightening his focus, I would stop. So I had effectively forced Slacking to do nothing for the entire rest of the battle unless he decided to go for something like Facade, which he never did. Even on the turns where I knew Norman would more than likely heal, I still chose to stay with the pattern. Even getting to the point towards the end of the battle where my stomps were basically doing half of Slacking's health at a time, which meant that if Norman's second Slacking had tried to use Slack Off at any time, I would have just undone any gains he made. And thanks to sticking with the pattern, I made it through the rest of the battle with Norman, even after the death of Mutant, without taking a single point of damage. But even with that in mind, I feel really bad about Mutant dying here. I think that he might have been able to survive the entire battle had I not gone for Bulk Up a second time. However, once Slakoth was able to get off Yawn, I think it was entirely up to luck whether or not he would wake up in time to survive. With access to Surf, I grabbed the Good Rod, and with it, Deep Trouble, the Whalmer, back in Dewford. Back on land, I grabbed Full Moon Fever, the Electrike, and realized I misspelled full as fool really early, but never fixed it because I thought it was funny. Then I also caught Wizard of Ooze, the Tropius, and had a really stressful battle against May. There are basically 3 reasons why I had any trouble in this battle. Number 1 is easily the rain, which meant that Torkoal's Flamethrower was not able to one-shot Grovyle. Number 2 is obviously Grovyle, who is incredibly fast and strong like we discussed back on Route 110, and that really hasn't changed. And finally, May is one of the only NPCs in Pokemon that switch out their Pokemon. Similar note, but not on the list for this battle in particular, for Grovyle also will have Pursuit for basically every major battle, so switching out again isn't exactly an option. So even though I was able to one-shot 2/3 of her team, her Grovyle was a problem because when my Torkoal wasn't able to one-shot it with Flamethrower because of the rain, she swapped over to Whalmer. Something that really just extended the fight by maybe 4 turns total, since as soon as Whalmer went down, I was able to paralyze Grovyle. But immediately after paralyzing Grovyle, my brain went monkey mode and I stopped going for the kill when I totally had it. But in my defense, May also never went for the kill either. Like, I think for this entire battle, I was still kind of scarred from the Norman fight, so I was overthinking every action. Because after getting Grovyle paralyzed, Minun's Quick Attack took it to red health, although he was also sent to red health. And I think my brain realized that Minun is in danger, swap out, instead of Minun is the danger, finish the job, which meant that Minun could have died if May had predicted me being dumb and gone for Pursuit. But she didn't, so when I brought in Fever Swamp, not only did she survive Leaf Blade, but then was able to finish off the already critically wounded Grovyle. So, endgame, this entire fight was way harder than it had to be. Then, before Winona, my final catch was Living Dummy the Absol, who I never used because I love Absol, but I like Mightyena more. If Pokemon were real, I'd probably have a Mightyena for a pet. And my team against Winona was Shock Street, Full Moon, Can't Scare Me, and Whalmer, but I'm not going to say his name because my microphone refuses to pick it up. I opened with Shock Street against Winona, who immediately was able to finish off Swellow even through Double Team. However, Winona brought out her ace second, but I also knew that Shock Street would more than likely outspeed her Altaria, and that it would probably try to go for Dragon Dance instead of Earthquake, so I thought I was safe for at least 1 turn. So I went for Thunder Wave instead of switching out, and it worked out in my favor. After that, I swapped over to Can't Scare Me, who I'd put Rock Tomb on, and used it to slow down Altaria through the Dragon Dances. Which never really happened because it used Dragon Dance once and then was paralyzed all but twice. And Can't Scare Me was able to bring Altaria to red health twice, forcing Winona to heal. Unfortunately though, Altaria broke through paralysis twice to hit with Aerial Ace and then Earthquake, which ultimately killed Can't Scare Me. Unlike with my previous death, I wasn't as hurt with this one since it was entirely on the table that if at any point Altaria used Earthquake, it would probably knock out one of my Pokemon. And unfortunately for Winona, it didn't throw me off at all because as soon as I swapped back to Shock Street, it was able to basically sweep her team, although Skarmory took 2 hits. And technically Pelipper because Skarmory set up Sand Attack and it missed 1 attack. I think it's also ironic that Winona's my favorite Hoenn gym leader, but I also kept calling her Skyla in my notes. Can't Scare Me was my second death in the run, and I feel bad that I revived him for 20 minutes only to let him die to Earthquake, and feel worse saying that even though his death did secure me the win, I'm glad it was him and not Shock Street or Full Moon. And maybe a little worse, that I felt horrible because I had a worse death after. Before I took on Mount Pyre, I decided to take on my rival May in Lily Cove, getting my entire team to either level 34 or 35 in the case of Egg Monster, who evolved into Altaria. I should qualify that Altaria is not necessarily one of my favorite Pokemon, but one that I have a deep connection to, because in my first ever Nuzlocke of Pokemon Emerald, I had an Altaria I was really close with. And unfortunately, she died against Juan, so I really wanted to keep Egg Monster alive. Even with the addition of Swellow, unlike the second and third battles against your rival in these games, this fourth one is rarely difficult. However, May still has Grovyle with Pursuit, and she still switches out her Pokemon. As you can see, when Horrorland fails to knock out Swellow, leaving it with just 6 health. May brought out her Numel second, and sensing a Magnitude incoming, I swapped over to Egg Monster and avoided a Magnitude 9. But then it chose to go for Focus Energy like Maxi did back on Mount Chimney when it was about to be knocked out. Then Wailmer went down just as easily, and May was down to just her last 2 Pokemon. However, remember that Swellow is at 6 HP. Because I've been going over this fight in my head a lot, and I don't think there was a way to avoid what happened next, without restarting and leading with a different Pokemon. May brought out Swellow, who even though I finished in the same turn, it used Endeavor and brought down Egg Monster to 6 HP. I knew that Egg Monster couldn't outspeed Grovyle, so I swapped out, but Grovyle predicted that using Pursuit, meaning it hit for double damage anyway, and killed Egg Monster. Horrorland came out, and without Rain to have its attack, Flamethrower was able to one-shot Grovyle, finishing off my final battle with May. I knew, because of how hard May is on Route 110, that she would most likely kill one of my Pokemon. What I didn't realize was that it would happen so late in the game. Of everything though, what hurt the most, not just that it was Egg Monster, my Altaria, she killed, but that she did it with Pursuit. A move I, as the player, hate because within the main game, you're almost never going to come across an AI that changes their Pokemon out. So unless you're battling a friend or battling competitively, you as the player will almost never come across a situation where Pursuit works. But the AI can use it because the player is almost always going to be switching out their Pokemon. While my logical brain knows that Egg Monster was more than likely slower than Grovyle, so even if I chose to stay in and use Fly, the death was assured unless I had swapped him out sooner. But it still felt really bad to have another Altaria die on my watch. Well, it's a good thing that my next stop was Mount Pyre, both because I was able to catch Strange Powers, the Metatite, but also because it's a graveyard for the now 3 souls I've led to their death. Following that visit, I'm just gonna skip through the story straight to catching Pasadena the Spheal in Shoal Cave and taking on Tate and Liza. They only have Solrock and Lunatone, who are both level 42. Which meant that even though I've been battling people with more Pokemon, I could only use 2 Pokemon for their battle. But I know I'm not supposed to say I have a favorite team member, but I battled them with my 2 favorite team members, Monster Blood and Fever Swamp. I'll be honest, the twins are way harder in Emerald, so in this game, they were way easier than Watson. And since Fever Swamp had learned Taunt before the battle, it meant I could lock them out of using Calm Mind safely, while Monster Blood did damage to both of them with Surf. And while in Generation 4 onward, Surf hits your ally during a double battle, it doesn't in Generation 3. I'm glad that Tate and Liza aren't the only double battle gyms anymore, but why weren't there more of these in Hoenn considering how many double battle Pokemon exist? Plusle, Minun, Solrock, Lunatone, Illumise, and Volbeat. Unfortunately, the rest of the battles in this game weren't as easy as this one. I started the Maxi fight out strong by using Mudshot after Intimidate. Ignoring that misplay, why do Maxi and Archie only have 3 Pokemon for the final confrontation? They have the same number of Pokemon as the admins. But also, more importantly, why do 2/3 of their team use Confusion? Sure, it didn't end up being that big of a deal, it just lengthened the fight a little in my case. But when there's only 3 Pokemon for an important battle, they should each make an impact. But even with my first turn misplay, I was basically able to play Maxi this entire battle. While not necessarily intentional, I kind of forced him to heal really early twice, once when I put his Mightyena in red health before I knocked it out the next turn, and once with his follow-up Crobat. Monster Blood's Surf against Crobat took about half of its health, and then seeing that I had Air Cutter, I swapped over to Pasadena, but for some reason on switch-in, Maxi healed his Crobat. And then promptly didn't use Air Cutter again, only going for Wing Attack and then Confuse Ray, which, again, only had Pasadena hurt himself in Confusion once before he broke out and knocked out Crobat. Maybe Maxi just really wanted his money's worth of super potions, since he realized that half of my team could sneeze the wrong way and knock out his ace. Since both of my other water types were at too low of health for me to really want to risk a switch against Camerupt, I chose to go into Wailord, and the first Earthquake took about half of his health. Which probably should have scared me, but Camerupt is 4 times weak to water, and my Wailord has a move that makes him invulnerable for a turn. So, with a single dive, I was able to finish off Maxi's last Pokemon and the Magma subplot. After finishing off the Magma storyline, I caught Shrunken Head the Groudon with the Master Ball I stole from Team Magma. Obviously. And then never used him because I didn't want to go through the hassle of getting Solar Beam from the Safari Zone. And for the final gym leader, I built a team of 5. Midnight, the now Cacturn, Shock Street, Full Moon, Wizard of Ooze, and Pasadena. Against Wallace, I chose to open Midnight to set up spikes, and if need be Leech Seed, although I only ended up setting up seeds on Love Disc. Primarily because Love Disc was able to confuse Midnight on the second turn, and I didn't want to risk her hurting herself in Confusion and then being killed because she didn't move. Because although Love Disc couldn't do a lot of damage, Wallace has 2 Pokemon that are actual threats, Celio and Milotic. And I guess Whiscash if you don't have a Pokemon immune to Earthquake. But for Midnight specifically, Milotic and Celio, who came out second after a critical hit Needle Arm, finished off Love Disc. However, Midnight was actually faster than Celio, so hitting through Confusion, she got a critical hit one-shot with Needle Arm. But I guess Wallace was tired of me making a fool of him, because then he sent out Milotic, who with a single Ice Beam was able to finish off the already weakened Midnight. This did hurt quite a bit, but I didn't let it throw me off, and with a pair of Sparks, Full Moon was able to finish off Milotic before she could cause any more trouble. And of course, since now I had an Electric type on the field, Wallace decided to gloat and bring out Whiscash, and he went for Earthquake, but I have Wizard of Ooze, who's immune to Earthquake, and has Magical Leaf. And since he had already jumped the gun and used his 3 good Pokemon, the only one left was Seaking, and it decided to set up Rain, while also being weak to Thunder. So even if by some miracle Wallace's Seaking was able to knock out Wizard of Ooze, I have 2 Pokemon that could have easily defeated it. Not that it mattered, because Wizard of Ooze was able to knock out Seaking in 2 Magical Leaps. Gym number 8 brought me death number 4. I felt really bad for Midnight because I've always wanted to use a Cacturn, but there have almost always been better options, so using her was really cathartic, but I was even really excited because of how well she seemed to be doing before Milotic came in. And of course, after reliving my trauma with Juan's Ice Beam being what killed my last Altaria, having another Pokemon die to Ice Beam in the 8th gym was just the cherry on top. With 8 gym badges and 4 deaths at that point, it was time to move on to the Elite Four, but before them, I had to take on Wally. And because no one is kind to my emotions, he of course led with Altaria, and I had to do away with it with a single Ice-type attack. Although in this case it was Aurora Beam. And then I was also able to easily finish off Roselia when it came to the field with another Aurora Beam. Unfortunately though, in my haste to finish the battle, my Oko streak would come to an end when I sent in Monster Blood. Because, of course, as soon as Magneton switched from using electric moves to Tri-Attack, Monster Blood was paralyzed, which, for the next few turns, prevented him from using Dig. For what it's worth, in my defense, I didn't mean to use Dig the second time, it was a misclick because I meant to use Mudshot. And luckily for me, by the time I actually chose to use Mudshot, it was more than enough to one-shot Magneton, sending Wally down to his last 2 Pokemon. Unfortunately for me, when I sent in Strange Powers against Delcatty, it was Charmed, which bought Delcatty an extra turn. Knowing that Wally was probably about to heal his Delcatty, I went for Rock Smash hoping for a defense drop that never ended up mattering. Because although the next high jump kick missed, draining half of Strange Powers' health, the third and final one went through and got a critical hit, knocking out Delcatty anyway. Which took Wally down to his most dangerous Pokemon, his ace Gardevoir. A Pokemon so dangerous because it can easily set up Calm Minds and Sweep that I made special precautions with Fever Swamp. I gave Fever Swamp Shadow Ball to get around any potential Calm Minds, and then also she still had Taunt, which was able to prevent Calm Mind for like a turn. And for some reason, Wally never ended up using Future Sight, even though it would have been able to hit me. So instead, I just had a really slow battle of using Bite over and over again, even though I had access to a physical move that would have done super effective damage anyway. Because I went out of my way to get and give Fever Swamp Shadow Ball, yet never ended up using it. Not like that could have led to any potential emotional trauma. Finally, I built a full team of 6 to battle the lead. Monster Blood, Horrorland, Strange Powers, Full Moon, Fever Swamp, and Wizard of Ooze. Wizard of Ooze because while I wanted a Salamence, I was not so lucky in Meteor Falls. Choosing to drop Shock Street in favor of Full Moon was really tough, but also Full Moon's stats are objectively better. However, I did still choose to use Fever Swamp over Absol. Having a choice between 2 physical Dark types in a generation where Dark is special, and I had already given Fever Swamp the Shadow Ball TM, so I couldn't get another without cheating. So had I swapped over to Living Dummy, they wouldn't have had access to Crunch because Absol only got Bite in Generation 3, and the best physical damage they could have done was Slash, so even with Swords Dance, it wouldn't have really helped. So even though Absol's stats were slightly better, I thought that Full Moon having Shadow Ball already, plus her ability Intimidate, would have helped. And the final preparation I made for the league was to level up my team to match Sydney's ace, and then just level them up in between the fights from here on. The battle against Elite Four Sydney was probably my biggest brain moment in the entire playthrough, because I knew that he would always lead with his intimidating Mightyena. So, in order to get around Intimidate and avoid any unnecessary switch-ins, I went and got a White Herb for Strange Powers. And then, at full attack, I just mowed down Sydney's entire team with Brick Break, only taking damage from Rough Skin from his Sharpedo. Unfortunately, this battle being so easy and using all that big brain power meant I made a lot of monkey brain decisions after this. Most importantly, and most damningly, I forgot to level up my team to match Phoebe's ace. So I effectively went up against her underleveled even though it wasn't by that much. So for the good of my remaining mental health, let's just get through this next battle together. I say that, but overall, I think I did as best a job as I could in this battle. Namely that I did a lot of prep work beforehand, seeing what moves Phoebe's Pokemon had, but also having that knowledge meant that I made a deadly mistake. Phoebe's ace Dusclops has Earthquake and Ice Beam, so after I took out her first Dusclops and it came out, I knew that it was going to throw out Earthquake, so I swapped over to Wizard of Ooze. And then I expected Dusclops to let off Ice Beam against Wizard of Ooze, so I swapped into Fever Swamp. But instead, it gave off Confuse Ray, and I didn't have a Persim Berry on Fever Swamp. And despite being lucky with Confusion earlier, I was not lucky this time, and Fever Swamp took a fair amount of damage from it and Ice Beam. Knowing it would be foolish to switch out at this point, I decided to hope for a stat drop on Crunch, but it didn't happen, and Fever Swamp was killed by Ice Beam. That one mistake of not putting a Persim Berry on Fever Swamp was enough to lead to her death. At this point, I was seeing red and wanted to do the most damage I could, even if it was neutral, and brought in Monster Blood, who was able to take Dusclops into healing range with his first Surf, and then a critical hit to knock out the killer Dusclops. Phoebe's first Banette came out next, and it was not lucky enough to avoid also falling to a critical hit Surf. It was able to let off a Spite, but that ultimately didn't matter. She followed that with her Sableye, who went down in 2 Surfs, although it was also able to do damage with Shadow Ball. After it fell, Phoebe was down to just her second Banette. Monster Blood and the second Banette traded blows, taking each other down to red health. Banette surviving with just a sliver. While I knew that Phoebe would most likely heal, I didn't want to risk Monster Blood's life in case she decided to go for the kill. So on the next turn, I risked it and swapped into Full Moon. Luckily for me, Phoebe did heal, and even though her Banette was able to Toxic Poison Full Moon on the next turn, Full Moon was faster and able to knock out Banette in 2 crunches. The death of Fever Swamp crushed me. And I don't know if the 2 levels I forgot to give her would have saved her, but losing not only a core team member hurt, but also losing one of the ones I relied on most in between gym battles. Unluckily for Glacia, I remembered to level up my team beforehand, so I hoped Strange Powers could make a repeat performance against her ice types, which for the most part she did, especially since she was able to take down the first Glalie in one shot. The trouble did start with the second outspeeding with Shadow Ball that took Strange Powers to just over half health. So even though it was also one shot, I probably should have been a bit more cautious, but Strange Powers was sort of able to alleviate any concern I had, since it was easily able to knock out the next Celio, with a critical hit no less. And then she was also able to knock out the second Celio in one shot without a critical hit. But unfortunately, I didn't get a critical hit against Walrein, so when it survived the first hit, Strange Powers did not, dying to Blizzard. Unlike losing Fever Swamp the battle before, losing Strange Powers didn't throw me off, so I just sent in Full Moon immediately. And even though Walrein's pretty bulky, one Thunderbolt was able to finish it off. While it did hurt to lose Strange Powers the battle after I lost Fever Swamp, the feeling of regret over grabbing all the heart scales it took to get them their level 1 punch moves hurt more. And then I was drowning in a feeling of dread because I was incredibly afraid of Steven's Cradilly. The worst thing about the Drake fight this time around was the panic that had set in when I had 2 deaths in a row. Because it was enough to make me super anxious, even though I've never had trouble with Drake so long as Swampert had Ice Beam, or like I had Walrein or Glalie. I was so concerned that when I misread Alteria's Dragon Dance as Dragon Breath, I just thought, well, that's all folks, before mowing it down and realizing that Monster Blood was still at full health. It was then that I realized that while I was probably going to take damage from Salamence and probably at least one of the Flygons, overall, this was probably going to be a massacre like Sydney. So even though one of the Flygons did successfully paralyze Monster Blood, by the time Salamence came out, I knew that Drake was not going to kill one of my Pokemon. I know it was probably plain luck, but at that point I trusted Monster Blood enough that I didn't worry about anything going into that final confrontation with Salamence. And I was rewarded by beating Drake without a single casualty, which meant it was now time to face Steven. I was a little worried about only having 4 Pokemon against his 6, but 3 of those are incredibly heavy hitters. And Wizard of Ooze was doing his best. More importantly, Monster Blood was worth at least 4 of Steven's Pokemon, and the only ones that worried me were Skarmory and Cradilly. And while Full Moon could easily take down Skarmory in probably one hit, I no longer had a fighting type to deal with Cradilly. So I knew that if the time came, I would probably have to lose a Pokemon. And I was prepared to take that risk. My battle against Steven started off great because Full Moon was able to one-shot Skarmory with Thunderbolt before it could set up Spikes or Toxic. Then, rather than force me to switch out using Claydol, Steven decided to go into Aggron. Full Moon and Aggron both traded blows, dragging each other down to red health, although Full Moon was left with exactly 1 HP after Aggron's Earthquake. I knew at that point that Steven was definitely going to heal on the next turn, so I decided to continue the offensive and went for a Thunderbolt against Aggron, taking half its health, and then finishing it off the next turn before it could attack more than once. And again, rather than wall me with Claydol, Steven sent in his ace Metagross. Knowing that Metagross was an insurmountable wall, I went for Thunder anyway, taking half of its health, but Metagross retaliated and killed Full Moon with a Psychic. With the clean switch, I chose to go into Horrorland, while Metagross healed with its berry. On the next turn, Metagross went for Earthquake, but it couldn't even bring Horrorland past half health. And, with a critical hit from Heatwave, Horrorland was able to take down Steven's ace, bringing it to a 3v3. It was only now that Steven brought in his Claydol, and wanting to save Horrorland in case I needed it for Credilli, I swapped over to Wizard of Ooze. After avoiding the Earthquake on switch-in, I decided to go for Magical Leaf over Solar Beam to try and whittle down Claydol's health. Unfortunately for me, it only did about a third of Claydol's health and left him with red HP, so Steven was able to heal. And although Claydol was nowhere near as dangerous as any of Steven's other Pokemon, it took the longest to beat because it was able to set up dual screens. And although I had strange powers mainly to deal with Credilli, it was also set up so that it had Brick Break to deal with screens. And Fever Swamp was also set up to deal with Claydol as a Dark type, with a physical Ghost move. While the rest of this fight was really tense and emotional, this part was just really boring because I sat there bringing his Pokemon to red health, and then he healed. And he only healed twice, so it's not like he used all of his full restores since he has 4. So I just sat there until finally the screens wore off and I was able to use Solar Beam to finally finish off Claydol. Then Steven finally brought out his Credilli, who I immediately paralyzed on switch-in with Body Slam, which gave Wizard of Ooze just enough time to get off 1 Solar Beam, although he did not make it to a second. Because Credilli was fully paralyzed 3 turns in a row, but not the 4th. So, while Wizard of Ooze charged her 2nd Solar Beam, she was taken down with a Sludge Bomb. Not wanting to take any chances and victory being in sight, I decided to send in Monster Blood, who was able to take Credilli to a sliver of health with Ice Beam, forcing Steven to heal for a 3rd time the next turn. Since Monster Blood was guaranteed to be faster than Credilli, I just used 2 more Ice Beams to finish off Credilli, taking Steven down to his last Pokemon. With nowhere to turn, Steven was backed fully into a corner, and with a pair of Surfs, Monster Blood was able to take down Armaldo, finishing my champion battle with Steven, and the challenge as a whole. I beat Pokemon Ruby as a hardcore Hoenn-only Nuzlocke. With my 2 final deaths, I finished the run and memorialized my party as champions of the Hoenn Elite Four. I finished the challenge off with 8 total deaths, and I know I could have avoided at least a few of them, especially if I had chosen to use berries other than Oran and Citrus. Although for both deaths against Steven and Can't Scare Me back against Winona, they were all tactical choices. I know I was a little negative about Nuzlocks in Crystal when I mentioned that I don't think a monotype run like it would be more fun or more challenging as a Nuzlocke, just more tedious. And that's because not only have I seen a lot of other YouTubers play Nuzlocks, I have played a bunch myself, just not for YouTube. And I think there's a bit of fatigue about Nuzlocks because of how prominent they are. And while I personally had fun playing this run, unlike some of my other challenges, it wasn't because it was a Nuzlocke, but more of just the mindset I was in when I played it. Mostly because I ended up playing this game a lot more like I play normally, where I use Pokemon I don't normally use, I don't heal in battle or overlevel. Really, the only difference was that I stopped using Pokemon if they were KO'd. Granted, I also have a pretty heavy Hoenn bias, with Emerald being my 2nd favorite game and Sapphire specifically being my 6th. But while I did have a lot of fun in this challenge, it also left me feeling like there was something more that could have been done. So in the future, I plan to play through another Nuzlocke run, but it'll probably be something like a Wedlock rather than just a standard Nuzlocke. Unfortunately, I'm not that versed in Nuzlocks, so most of the ones I know are the standard version, Genlocks, Wedlocks, Egglocks, Soul Links, Wonderlocks, and Hardcore Nuzlocks. And most of those aren't exactly conducive to the types of video I make, so if you have an idea for a Nuzlocke challenge I could use in the future, maybe leave it down below in the comments or in the community tab thread I have for challenges. Anyway, my next run is going to be in Fire Red instead of Sapphire, just to add a little variety. It's going to be a fusion between my Pokemon Blue challenge, where I rebuilt my team after every gym, and my Pokemon Red challenge, where no two team members could have the same evolution method. And on top of that, the Pokemon are going to be somewhat randomized. So, no matter where I see you next, remember to love yourselves, and I'll see you in my next upload.